Loving Kindness by Pema Chodron. What is that allows our goodwill to expand and our prejudice and anger to decrease? This is a significant question. Traditionally, it is said that the root of aggression and suffering is ignorance. But what is that we are ignoring? Entranced in the tunnel vision of our personal concerns, what we ignore is our kinship with others. One reason we train as warrior Buddhists, bodhisattvas, is to recognize our interconnectedness, to grow in understanding that we harm one another, we are harming ourselves. So we train in recognizing our uptightness. We train in seeing that others are not so different from ourselves. We train in opening our hearts and minds in increasingly difficult situations.
Our second reading is called Breaking the Spell of Negative Emotions by Sam Harris. Most of us let our negative emotions persist longer than is necessary. Becoming suddenly angry, we tend to stay angry, and this requires that we actively produce the feeling of anger. We do this by thinking about our reasons for being angry, recalling an insult, rehearsing what we should have said to our malefactor, and so forth. And yet we tend not to notice the mechanics of this process. Without continually resurrecting the feeling of anger, it is impossible to stay angry for more than a few moments. Thinking is indispensable to us. It is essential for belief formation, planning, explicit learning, moral reasoning, and many other capacities that make us human. Thinking is the basis of every social relationship and cultural institution we have. It is also the foundation of science. But our habitual identification with thought, that is, our failure to recognize thoughts, as appearances in consciousness, is a primary source of human suffering. It also gives rise to the illusion that a separate self is living inside one's head.
At some point this year, I became interested in studying about anger. A while into this research, I began to wonder where this interest was coming from. I finally remembered that at some point I had heard a talk online where Stoic philosopher William Irvine was discussing anger from a Stoic perspective. I was moved to buy his book, The Stoic Challenge, A Philosopher's Guide to Becoming Tougher, Calmer, and More Resilient. He states that anger is incompatible with happiness. Indeed, anger can be thought of as anti-joy. Consequently, getting frustrated in response to a setback only makes things worse. Then he concludes, as a result of this investigation, I found myself getting angry about my tendency to get angry about foolish things. It was time I decided to deal with my anger issue. I was amused by this until, as my anger awareness developed, I too found myself getting angry at my anger. If you're curious about what makes me angry, I'd say number one on my list is anger. I get angry with people who are angry. Anger makes me angry. As I continued the study, I discovered another thing that contributed to my anger: thoughts. This might not be surprising. What is surprising was the thoughts that precipitated the anger, as were many other thoughts, were unbidden. I was often thinking a thought I had not decided to think. When I say it like that, it sounds pretty obvious, but I still find it surprising how many of my angry thoughts come to me when actually I have no desire to think them. They did not bring joy. Now I see a dilemma. Studying anger is also studying thinking. Now at this time, I'm going to go back and give a definition of anger. This from your old friend, ChatGPT. Anger can be defined as a strong and intense emotional response, typically triggered by a perceived threat, injustice, frustration, or provocation. It is a natural human emotion that arises when one's needs, desires, or expectations are unmet or violated. Anger is often accompanied by psychological changes such as increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure, and tension in the body. Okay, ChatGPT, pretty good. GPT, sorry. So a strong and intense emotional response typically triggered by a perceived threat, injustice, frustration, or provocation. That's easy to understand. It can even provide a sort of happiness, deciding that I'm right and someone else is wrong. And in many situations, someone needs to be right. But it also brings in a sense of conflict and separation that doesn't feel good. Maybe that's necessary, but I'm beginning to think I want as little of that separation as possible. Maybe anger can be the alarm bell. Something's wrong here. Then I can move on to find the most peaceful way possible to solve the problem. And that may start with me smiling and thinking to myself, surely we can do this. I do find, corny as it sounds, smiling can often change my mood. Oh, I love to see that nod. I continued this study. I noticed more anger coming from me than I expected. No tantrums, not too much yelling, but I'm seeing more judgment, more anti-joy than needed. I realize I'm providing maybe a little too much ammunition to all of you the next time you see me get angry. Like so much anger, it is unbidden. Someone says something I don't like, and there is a judgmental anger, often low-key, which probably caused some of you to think to yourself, what's wrong with that? I'm not going to sweat it a lot, but still, it's a little wall between me and someone else. Now, as there is anger that deals with big issues, safety issues, oppression issues, and such. But right now, I'm in the category of anger about not horrible things. Alain de Botton describes some of the problems with this kind of anger when he says, by the time we've humiliated someone, they're not going to learn anything. The only condition, and we know this with children, the only condition under which anyone learns are conditions of incredible sweetness, tenderness, and patience. That's how we learn. Often genuine, legitimate things we want to get across just come across as insults, as attempts to wound, and are therefore rejected. Isn't that nice? So this anger research was going nicely when a few days ago I ran into an obstacle. I got pretty angry, angrier than I remember being in this third of my life. I made a careless and unintentional, but still hurtful statement to a friend in an email, and she replied quite angrily. To me, shockingly angry, with some insults thrown in. I was going out to eat with my daughter, so I forgot about it. I went to bed, thought about it a little, and fell asleep. Until 2 a.m. I woke up and went over and over the whole thing, again and again. Then I listened to a podcast to get my mind off of it. And then the podcast is over and I still felt miserable. Tried to sleep, but couldn't. Got up around 6 a.m., read the paper, drank tea, ate cereal. Around 8 a.m., I tried to sleep again. No luck. Listened to a short TED Talk. Didn't sleep. Wondered, how can I give a sermon on anger if I'm going to be like this? I remembered my Waking Up book by Buddhist author Sam Harris and turned to the section, Breaking the Spell of Negative Emotion. What does it say? I started my contemplation with this line, pay close attention to negative feelings, themselves without judgment, resistance. Good start. It felt good to pay attention to feelings rather than thoughts. Next, he asked, what is anger? That's a very different question when you're asking your feelings instead of your thoughts. Now it was just a feeling. It was a sad feeling and sometimes a scary feeling. I don't think I was actually shaking or tearing up, but I felt it under the surface. After walking with the question for a while, I lit my candle and sat down in my meditation chair, trembling, crying a little inside but not outside, laughing because it was all so silly, continuing with the sad and scary until I only needed to laugh at myself. It really was over. I don't know if I've ever stood in front of a group before and told such a personal story. Embarrassing, honest, and it seems kind of necessary. I'm seeing that there is a lot to learn about anger. I'm still a student, but I've learned a lot during this study. Now we'll switch to Dr. Louise, who will continue by describing ways that anger can be helpful and promote safety and social justice.
My name is Dr. Louise. My pronouns are she, her, and I am an angry woman. I'm angry at my mother, who upon realizing that my existence would not cause my grandmother to treat her like an adult, decided to abandon me for life. I'm angry at my father, who used me to fulfill his emotional needs for 3 decades before I had the space to figure out what was happening. I am angry at the fat phobia and misogyny and other hierarchical structures that keep folks who claim to care about me from using my earned and preferred name, Dr. Louise. I am angry about many things. The very first philosophy book I ever read was Marcus Aurelius's The Meditations. While this Roman emperor was out killing people in battle, he wrote this compilation of short-form commentary on the value of not being ruled by one's emotions. I found comfort in the idea that I could control my inner world and refrain from expressing emotions like anger while living in a household with 2 abusive parents and no resources of my own. As a student, I discovered Buddhist philosophy and realized we didn't have to control our emotions. Instead, we could allow emotions like anger to move through us. We no longer had to identify with those feelings, but simply give them a space to exist and move right along. After years of practicing both Stoic and Buddhist teachings, I have found my home with neither. Today, I believe anger has an important role to play, and I'm not alone in thinking that. The primary kind of anger that I harbor is what Aristotle would consider rationally justified anger. This is anger that makes sense. This is the kind of anger we experience when we have been morally wronged. Aristotle, perhaps unsurprisingly, would challenge ChatGPT's definition of anger. As Dr. Gregory Sandler describes, one of the most distinctive features of Aristotle's approach to anger is that, unlike many other ancient, medieval, and modern thinkers, he doesn't consider anger uniformly or even generally bad. In fact, he comes right out in saying that there are times when we ought to get angry, to feel the emotion and to act upon it. According to Aristotle, in the face of certain injustices, it would be irrational to resist our anger. A virtuous person works to identify those circumstances where it makes sense to be angry. But of course, the question remains, how do you know when it makes sense? On this point, Aristotle's not so clear. He basically thinks you need to evaluate it on a case-by-case basis, with a few patterns being clear. For example, if someone is maliciously attacking you, Aristotle thinks anger is a virtuous response. But we certainly naturally get angry in more circumstances than just that. Contemporary philosopher Dr. Maisha Cherry takes up the defense of anger in her book, The Case for Rage. Here she is pushing back against the angry Black woman stereotype and is looking at the role of anger when it comes to racism. She defends a very specific kind of anger. She calls this Lordian rage. It is named after the political activist Audre Lorde. According to Dr. Cherry, this kind of anger is different than the kind Mary Alice was just describing to us. Rather than this anger being anti-joy, Dr. Cherry argues that Lordian rage is compatible with other emotions like joy and love. Lordian rage is a kind of anger that comes up specifically in the wake of racism. According to Dr. Cherry, this anger is transformative, it is non-destructive, and it is key to the anti-racist struggle. She claims that this sort of anger is good because it shows that racial justice is worth the struggle and helps us all recognize injustice where it stands. Lordian rage is a kind of anger that doesn't necessarily require any angry behavior. We don't have to slam our fist on the table. We don't have to punch our neighbor. We don't have to engage in anything like that. But instead, Lordian rage fuels the action needed to create substantial change. Here, Dr. Cherry has articulated one of the things I value the most about anger. For me, anger motivates me to take action. For me, anger calls me to help bring this world just a little bit closer to a world where things are better, where justice is possible. I tend to think of myself as having a kind of existential anger. It runs in the background of my experience. At my best, I make conscious choices about when to lean into that background noise. At my worst, I impulsively react to stimuli in my environment with the full force of the anger I've been cooking since my own mother abandoned me. The anger doesn't go away, but I can choose how to relate to that anger. I take comfort in the Stoics and Buddhist tools to help me slow down my own responses to stimuli that might make me angry. These tools help me make conscious choices about how I want to relate to anger. And I take comfort in Aristotle and Dr. Cherry's recognition that being angry is not inherently irrational and may at times be the right thing to express. For me, the challenge is to learn how to dance with anger in a way that allows me to show up the best I can today.
The collection will now be taken.